Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, the direct route to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Welcome back. This is part 2 of Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis, and I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. In part 1, we provided you an overview of this process and looked at the inputs. And now in part 2, we're going to take a look at the tools, techniques, outputs, and reviews. And if you remember this from part 1, yes, we put them in the correct order again there for you. So first the tools of techniques, then the outputs, then the review. Let's get going. We want to perform a qualitative risk analysis. So what are the tools and techniques that are at our disposal to do that? Well, there are 6 of them. First of all, there is the risk probability and impact assessment. Then we have the probability and impact matrix. We have the risk data quality assessment. We have risk categorization, risk urgency assessment, and expert judgment. Our first tool and technique, the risk probability and impact assessment, is in fact 2 tools in one. It's a probability assessment and an impact assessment. The probability assessment will tell you how likely it is that a risk will actually occur, and the impact assessment tells you how good or bad the effects of this risk occurring are going to be. In particular, we're interested in the effect of this risk on our project objectives like time, cost, schedule, and quality. And by the way, did you notice that I said how good or bad it's going to be? Don't forget that a risk can be positive or negative. We not only want to assess and prioritize our threats in this process, we also want to assess and prioritize our top opportunities. Okay, so how do you do this assessment? Simple. You discuss your risks with your stakeholders. You talk to your project team, customers, sponsors, and others who may be familiar with particular risk areas or categories. But let's be honest here. How many of us actually have a lot of experience in doing this kind of risk assessment? Well, probably not many. So what do? Well, we find an experienced risk manager who can act as a facilitator in this process and guide us through it. Make sure that you include an explanation for any assumptions that are made when assessing the probability or impact for a risk. And as you conduct your interviews or meetings with or without this external facilitator, you will assign a numerical value to the probability as well as the impact for each of your risks. These values are often expressed from 0 to 1. 0 meaning no probability at all of occurring, and 1 meaning 100% certainty that a risk will actually become an issue. But of course, you can also use a 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 scale. 0 to 1 is just most common. And if you remember, these numerical values and their definitions, they were created early on and recorded in the risk management plan as we planned our risk management approach in the first process here in the risk management knowledge area. Here in Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis, we simply apply them. As a result of the qualitative risk analysis or assessment, you will end up with a probability and impact rating for each and every single one of your risks, which will then be used to prioritize them for further quantitative assessment and response planning. This table here is an example of such an assessment using a scale of 1 to 5. As you can see, we have the risks on the left and then an assessment of probability and impact for each risk on the right. You can also see that sales outperform production capacity is an opportunity. If the customers love our product and buy it like crazy, we should find a way to improve capacity and be able to produce more of our product so that more people can buy it. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. We first have to figure out which of these risks and opportunities we want to focus on. Let's do that. Now that we assigned these values for probability and impact, we can use the probability and impact matrix. This matrix is basically a lookup table. Vertically, you see the probability, and horizontally, you find the impact scale. Now you can place each of your risks into this table based on the probability and impact that you had assigned. For instance, the risk that our technology improvements must be included in the final product has a probability of 4 and an impact of 3. So it would land where you see the red star there. Probability of 4 horizontally, impact of 3 vertically. What you can also see nicely here is the different shades in the cells. They show you how important this risk is for your project. The importance again is defined in the risk management plan, which describes what high, medium and low risks are. Finally, based on the priority and impact, you can then define and determine actions or responses that are appropriate for each risk. You can actively and aggressively manage or mitigate the high risks, continuously monitor the medium ones, and stick the rest on your watch list for later. On a high level, a probability and impact matrix has 3 benefits. First of all, organizations have a separate matrix for each objective: cost, scope, schedule, and quality, depending on how risks need to be weighed. Then opportunities and threats can be handled in the same matrix, and the PMBOK guide actually has a nice example for this and shows you how this can be done. And lastly, a benefit of using such a table is that we can quickly see the priority of our risks graphically and therefore determine the appropriate action and response. We have to make sure that the information we have about our risks is correct. So in order for the data, the information about a risk to be useful, it should be assessed for quality, and only then should it be used for risk assessment. To achieve this level of certainty, we conduct a data quality assessment for our risks to determine the degree to which the data, the information about a risk is useful. If risk quality is poor, then additional data, additional information about a risk needs to be gathered. And finally, the collection of information about each risk can be very time-consuming, so it should be balanced against the probability and impact that the risk presents. Remember, unreliable data, unreliable information about our risks will very likely result in faulty risk prioritization. Another approach that is very helpful when assessing your risks is categorization. Categorizing risks can help you determine how urgent risks are. Let's assume you have 262 risks in your risk register. That just seems like a huge number. That is very difficult to manage. But if we categorize them, they become more manageable. A good practice is also to categorize them by their root cause, which we identify by using the fishbone diagram in the Identify Risks process. If you know that 4 of your 262 risks have poor maintenance as their root cause, well, you can now address 4 risks at once. This risk categorization can be approached in many ways. For instance, we already learned we can categorize them by source or by the root cause, and this root cause categorization can assist us in developing proper risk responses. But we can also categorize them in the area of the project that is affected by looking at our WBS, or it can be associated with other useful categories such as the project phase, so we can see what phase may be most exposed to risk and plan accordingly. Another way to assess our risks qualitatively is to consider risk urgency. The reason for doing so are many, of course. Near-term risks, that's the number one reason, require an immediate response, and therefore they will have a high priority. But long-term risk, a risk that may occur 3 years down the road, will get a lower priority. Some common indicators of priority include things like the probability of the risk being detected, how long it will take to respond to the risk appropriately, even if it's 3 years down the road. If it takes you 2 years to prepare a risk response, you better get going right away. Are there any symptoms? Are there any warning signs that we can expect from this risk? And of course, a risk rating. Sometimes the urgency assessment is combined with risk rating to give you a final risk severity rating. Remember back in part 1, when we looked at our overview of the inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs, I said in regards to the outputs, the most interesting thing to note is that the word risk doesn't actually occur anywhere within the output that we have. The output is simply we have project document updates as an output. And the fact that the word risk doesn't appear here is actually only true on the surface, because the question is, which project documents do we update? Well, there are two. There is the risk register. There we go. The word risk now appears. And there is also the assumptions log. Remember that the risk register is not just necessarily one document. It can be a whole document package. So what do we update? Here's an overview of the tools that we use on the one side and the areas of the risk register that we update on the right side. First and foremost, of course, we have the rankings and priority of our risks, which we identify through the probability and impact assessment. Remember that we use the matrix to assign values, and we should now have a high, medium, or low statement for each of our risks. That way we put emphasis on the risks with the highest ranking. Then the data quality assessment will likely lead to updates in the current assessed data, any new data, and will improve the quality of data that we gather going forward. Remember also what we said about categorization. If you categorize the risks, you can address them by category. And of course, adding a category for each risk means that we have just updated the risk register with a new column, the category column. We also figured out the urgency for our risks and made a note of it in the register. That too is considered an update. Or maybe we have put one of our risks on our watch list. That as well, again, is an update to our risk register. And finally, expert judgment can affect updates to all areas that we have just previously mentioned here in this list. And over the course of a project, one item that may also come up is that you seem to be noticing trends over time. A certain type of risk seems to be happening more and more, so you're going to be updating trends as well. As with all analysis, we learn new things and additional insights come up and new knowledge is created, and that has an effect on the basis of previous assumptions. And when this occurs, we need to update those assumptions and anything that we derived that was based on these assumptions. Remember the data quality we talked about earlier? Well, sometimes the assumptions may be part of the project scope or could be listed in separate assumptions logs. New information from performing qualitative risk analysis may lead to changes in previously held assumptions. It's a good idea at this time to review the assumptions log to identify those entries that may no longer be valid, as well as information based on those prior assumptions. Let's review. In the Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis process, we want to prioritize the identified risks as high, medium, and low. We do this because we should use our time wisely and only focus on the important risks out of the 3,000 that we have identified. And the tools and techniques in this process will help us do this prioritization. As a result, we will update our risk register with additional information, including the priority, which helps us focus on the really important ones during the next process. And to close out this lesson, we have a few areas of focus for you to consider in regards to PMP exam sample questions. So you need to think about what are some ways that risks are analyzed qualitatively. Well, there are three areas. There's the probability and impact assessments, there are matrices, and there is risk categorization that you have to be familiar with. And what are some things to consider when you're performing the qualitative risk analysis? Well, consider that we need to identify our own bias towards risks and eliminate it if at all possible. We have to consider the data quality, because bad data will lead to bad decisions. And of course, we have to update our assumptions. And this concludes our look into the Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis process. So Justine and I say goodbye. Justine?
Make like a tree and leave.
Until next time.